It began with a rumor, a whisper that Washington had quietly added Burkina Faso to its list of countries under visa restrictions. The message was simple: you're not welcome. But in Ouagadougou, the capital of a nation that refuses to bow, that message echoed differently. On the dusty parade grounds of the military academy, the air trembled not from fear, but from engines. A new fleet of armored reconnaissance vehicles stood lined in the sun, their matte paint catching the morning light like bronze shields. And there he was, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest leader on the continent, walking among his soldiers, inspecting each machine with his own hands. While Washington was tightening borders, Burkina Faso was tightening bolts. While the U.S. was issuing bans, Traoré was issuing orders: build, protect, stand tall. The crowd watching him that morning didn't see a man defying a superpower. They saw a man defending dignity. La patrie ou la mort, nous vaincrons. They shouted. The homeland or death we shall overcome. For decades, Africa's strength has been defined by others. But what happens when one small nation decides to define itself? When a country once written off as poor dares to rise armed, not only with new weapons, but with conviction. That's the story. The headlines won't tell you the story of how a U.S. visa ban became a spark for sovereignty. Share this video if you believe that truth travels farther than sanctions. Subscribe if you stand with those who defend their dignity, not with weapons, but with courage. The morning sun of Ouagadougou was blinding, painting the red soil in gold. A soft hum filled the air, not from chants or speeches, but from the low rumble of military engines warming up for display. This wasn't a parade for show. It was proof. In front of rows of soldiers and citizens stood a new line of machines, armored reconnaissance vehicles, freshly delivered, gleaming with the dust of the Sahel. They were not imported luxuries, but the result of local coordination, national resolve, and a defense doctrine that now carried Burkina Faso's own fingerprint. At the center of it all was President Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't stay behind a podium. He walked straight onto the ground's helmet in hand, inspecting each piece of equipment with the focus of a mechanic and the pride of a soldier. Cameras followed him as he tested the controls, leaned into the driver's seat, and spoke directly to the operators. Beside him, a young officer explained how these vehicles could detect enemy positions, calculate coordinates, and send them instantly to command units. "This is our shield," the officer said. "It is also our voice." The crowd erupted in applause. Some cried, some saluted. For them, it wasn't about machines, it was about meaning. Every screw, every sensor symbolized independence from the powers that once dictated their defense and destiny. And just as the engines roared, a different kind of declaration came, not from the military, but from the foreign minister. His tone was firm, his words clear. Burkina Faso will not accept the unjust measures of the United States. But to those expelled who seek refuge on our soil, our doors are open. In that single statement, Burkina turned confrontation into compassion. While others saw the U.S. visa restrictions as punishment, Traoré's government saw them as an opportunity to reaffirm what kind of nation they wanted to be: free, just, and proudly African. The people understood immediately. The United States might have the power to decide who enters its territory, but Burkina Faso, they believed, held the moral power to decide what it stands for. The live stream from the event spread across social media. Millions tuned in. The comments flooded with messages like, "We are proud of you, Captain, a small country with a big heart. This is the Africa we were waiting for." The soldiers posed behind their new equipment for photographs. Children waved flags. The atmosphere was electric, not with anger, but with purpose. For decades, Africa's stories of defense had been written in someone else's ink contracts, signed in Paris, instructions drafted in Washington, weapons manufactured elsewhere. But on this day, the pen had changed hands. Burkina Faso, long dismissed as a fragile state, had just introduced itself as a sovereign one. The message was unmistakable: no longer dependent, no longer afraid. That's why the moment resonated far beyond the borders of the Sahel. It wasn't just about tanks or missiles. It was about a principle that a nation's dignity cannot be sanctioned, restricted, or denied a visa. As the ceremony ended, the soldiers stood tall, saluting their commander. Traoré raised his hand in return, not high like a ruler, but level with his men as a comrade. And somewhere in the background, through the echo of applause and the hum of engines, a single sentence could be heard again and again: "La patrie ou la mort, nous vaincrons." The homeland or death we shall overcome. The moment the president stepped down from the armored vehicle, the noise of the crowd was deafening. Soldiers clapped their hands against their chests, civilians waved flags made from old cloth, and the chant began to rise: "Traoré, Traoré, Traoré." It wasn't just a name. It was a pulse, a heartbeat of defiance. Burkina Faso, once known in Western headlines only for poverty and insurgency, had just shown the world something it couldn't unsee: a nation standing on its own feet. The video clips from the ceremony exploded across the internet. Within hours, millions had watched them from Bamako to Boston, from Dakar to Washington, D.C. And somewhere deep within the corridors of power, the echo of that chant reached uneasy ears. The U.S. State Department, when asked by reporters, refused to comment directly on Traoré's statements, but anonymous officials told major outlets that the United States remains concerned about democratic transitions in the Sahel. That phrase, concerned about transitions, had become the polite language of pressure. Yet in Ouagadougou, the phrase was translated very differently: they fear what we are becoming. Inside Burkina Faso, emotions surged. Citizens flooded social media with pride. Mothers dressed their children in miniature military uniforms, calling them sons of the revolution. University students marched across campus waving flags, chanting, "We are not their backyard anymore." And for the first time in a long time, the word Burkina, the land of honest people, began trending worldwide. But it wasn't just the people celebrating. From neighboring Mali and Niger, military leaders sent public messages of solidarity. "An attack on one is an attack on all," said a colonel from Niamey. The Sahel Alliance, a pact of the 3 Sahel nations, suddenly looked less like a defense bloc and more like the seed of a continental movement. Meanwhile, in Paris, French media outlets debated whether Traoré's stance was provocative or inspirational. On American talk shows, analysts spoke cautiously about the new nationalism in Africa. One host admitted, "We underestimated him." And in Africa itself, the reaction was electric. Activists across Ghana, Senegal, and even South Africa began organizing solidarity days, waving the flags of Burkina Faso beside their own. The high point came when a viral video captured a simple, unforgettable image: Traoré standing in silence, hand on the hood of the armored vehicle, as a young soldier saluted him with tears in his eyes. The soldier whispered, "We have waited our whole lives for this." That image, one man's hand on a machine, one soldier's tears, became the symbol of something greater than politics. It was the image of dignity returned. But beyond emotion came tension. Washington's diplomatic cables, leaked days later, warned regional partners that Burkina Faso's militarization and anti-U.S. rhetoric could destabilize cooperation. The phrase "destabilize cooperation," another polite mask, hinted at real unease. For decades, Western powers had defined African strength as dependence, aid, not autonomy, security, not sovereignty. But Traoré had just rewritten that equation. The crowd in Ouagadougou didn't hear the cautious words of diplomats. They heard their own anthem rising louder: "We are free because we stopped asking for permission." As night fell, the city glowed not with fireworks, but with hope. The people of Burkina Faso, miners, mothers, students, farmers, stood under the same sky, whispering a single truth: if this small nation could stand tall, maybe the entire continent could too. And somewhere across the ocean, in offices filled with polished wood and quiet fear, a question began to take shape: what if this time Africa doesn't back down? In the weeks that followed, the noise of engines gave way to the rhythm of work. Across Burkina Faso, something profound began to unfold, not through slogans, but through silent transformation. At military bases, the newly delivered vehicles weren't just displayed, they were studied. Mechanics from small towns came to learn how to repair them. University students volunteered to translate technical manuals from French into local languages. The sight of young engineers in dusty uniforms working late into the night became a new symbol of patriotism. It was no longer about one man, it was about a movement. Across the capital, murals of Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared on walls surrounded by words like "souveraineté" and "Faso d'abord," sovereignty and homeland first. But these weren't propaganda posters. They were love letters from a people rediscovering belief in themselves. For decades, foreign aid had shaped what Burkinabe children could eat, study, and dream. But now the narrative had shifted. When the government announced a new training initiative for rural defense units, thousands signed up within hours. When the national radio broadcasted Traoré's message of unity, millions listened, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Even in villages far from the capital, where the red earth meets the horizon, old men gathered under mango trees, discussing politics like never before. "We don't just follow orders now," one said softly. We understand them. Politically, the shockwave was undeniable. The AS Alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger tightened coordination. A shared command center was quietly established near Ouagadougou, marking a historic step toward regional defense independence. Within parliament, even opposition figures admitted privately, we are witnessing the birth of a new chapter. But sovereignty always comes with sacrifice. Western development partners began reviewing contracts, freezing aid programs, and slowing financial assistance. Yet the reaction from the streets was surprising. There was no panic, no outrage. Instead, people began repeating a new phrase circulating in marketplaces and cafes. If freedom costs more than aid, we will still pay the price. Socially, something even deeper was happening. The young began to see education not as an escape from the country, but as a tool to rebuild it. Songs dedicated to the rebirth of the homeland played on local radio. Women's cooperatives in Bobo Dioulasso organized sewing drives to make new military uniforms, a small gesture, but rich in symbolism. The mothers of Burkina now clothed its defenders. The change wasn't only patriotic, it was psychological. The decades of dependency had left scars of inferiority. Now those scars were being replaced with pride. And in the heart of the capital, the same plaza where Traore had inspected the armored vehicles became a gathering place not for protests, but for lessons in citizenship. Every weekend, veterans, teachers, and elders met the youth to talk about discipline, duty, and dignity. In less than 2 months, a nation once fractured by poverty and fear had begun to find its soul again. The world called it militarization. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was something far greater: the return of belief. In Washington, the story didn't fit the usual playbook. A small West African nation landlocked under embargo facing sanctions had just turned a visa ban into a moment of national glory. Analysts at think tanks scrambled to explain it. One report from the Center for Strategic Policy called it symbolic resistance. Another from a congressional hearing described Traore as a charismatic populist with unpredictable momentum. But between those cold lines of analysis, a quieter fear was taking shape. What if Burkina Faso wasn't an exception but a beginning? The U.S. had intended the visa restriction as pressure, a signal to the military government that Washington disapproved of its undemocratic transition. Yet instead of isolating the country, the move had galvanized it. Across the Atlantic, France watched nervously. For Paris, Traore's defiance cut deeper than any sanction. In cafes and newsrooms, journalists debated whether the Burkina effect might spread, whether Mali, Niger, and even Francophone neighbors would follow the same path, rejecting Western aid, reclaiming resources, and rewriting history. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the reaction was different, almost celebratory. Russian media praised Traore as the Thomas Sankara of the 21st century, framing him as proof that Africa no longer needed to choose submission over sovereignty. Beijing's commentaries were more measured yet unmistakably supportive. Africa's self-reliance is an irreversible process. But the most striking reaction came from the African diaspora, especially African Americans who saw in Traore's courage a reflection of their own struggles. Social media exploded with hashtags like Na Burkina Strong and Mash Dignity, has no visa. One viral post read, "They banned his people from entering America. But his courage entered our hearts." On talk radio across Atlanta, Chicago, and New York, callers spoke of Traore not as a politician, but as a symbol of what it means to stand your ground when the world expects you to bow. Even in Europe, where headlines often framed him as controversial, polls quietly revealed something unexpected. A growing number of young people admired his defiance. To them, he wasn't just another African leader, he was a mirror of integrity in a world of compromise. For Washington, the question was no longer whether to pressure Traore, but how to deal with a movement built on pride, not profit. Traditional tools, aid, trade, or threats no longer worked against a generation willing to walk barefoot for freedom. Behind closed doors, some diplomats admitted what few dared say publicly. We underestimated the hunger for dignity. We thought Africa wanted assistance. It wanted respect. By the time global networks replayed the footage of Traore inspecting those armored vehicles, the message had already transcended politics. It wasn't about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about the return of self-belief to a continent long told to wait its turn. And as one European columnist concluded in Le Monde, the West has discovered something unsettling, that the most powerful weapon in Africa today is not the gun, but the idea of sovereignty. When the engines fell silent that evening, a strange calm covered Ouagadougou. The air still smelled of fuel and dust, but beneath it was something more powerful, the scent of awakening. Burkina Faso had not declared war. It had declared worth, and that frightened the world more than any weapon ever could. For generations, the script had been simple. Africa struggles, the West responds, the cycle repeats. But this time, something broke. The story refused to end the same way. One nation, small, landlocked, and defiant, had chosen to write a different final chapter. From Washington's corridors to Parisian boardrooms, a quiet unease lingered. If a country like Burkina Faso could challenge the system and survive, what might happen if 20 more did? What if the rest of Africa realized that dignity needs no permission? Slip. President Ibrahim Traoré's message was not shouted, it was lived. He didn't posture with speeches, he proved his point through discipline, through building, through action. His defiance wasn't reckless, it was moral. And maybe that's the part the world isn't ready to face, that the power of example travels faster than fear. For the people of Burkina Faso, this is not about pride or politics. It's about protection, about being the generation that decided once and for all that the soil beneath their feet belongs to them, not to the institutions that once claimed to save them. As night fell, the city lights flickered like embers. Children still wore paper flags on their backs. Mothers whispered prayers for peace. And on every rooftop, you could almost hear the same quiet question echo through the warm African wind. If we can stand this tall, what else have we been told we cannot do? Perhaps that's the real warning, not to Africa, but to the world. Because every time a people rise with dignity, empires tremble in silence. Share this if you believe that courage is the true language of sovereignty. Subscribe if you believe that truth, not power, will write Africa's next chapter. Burkina Faso has spoken. The question now is, who's listening?